Well, hey everyone, once again, welcome to your weekly life group leader training video. We're so excited about this week. We are finishing our series in 1 Timothy. So this week our passage is 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 3 through 21, right up to the end of 1 Timothy. And we're wrapping up this letter from Paul to a disciple of his that he loves dearly, named Timothy, as he's working in the church in Ephesus. So if you have your Bibles, why don't you go ahead and spend some time in that passage before you watch this video, and then you return to this video and get prepared for leading your group. But this week, it's an interesting conclusion to the book of 1 Timothy. We get the only flee statement from Paul in 1 Timothy, where Paul challenges Timothy to flee something, and that very thing is greed. Of all things, it's greed, something that I think is very prevalent in our community and not something that we talk about a lot. But here's the problem in Ephesus. It's clear, Paul makes it clear, there are leaders in the church who are not only preaching a false gospel, but they're preaching a false gospel so that they can make money. We see in Paul's letter to the church in Corinth that it was a common practice for speakers to receive a payment from their audience, the way that we typically do a love offering in churches today. It was something along those lines. A speaker would speak, and then they would take up an offering from the audience to pay that speaker for the spiritual benefit that they'd given them. They'd return a material blessing to them. And we see Paul addressing this in the church in Corinth, and he talks about how Paul refused to receive that payment because of the gospel. Well, apparently, the leaders in Ephesus, they are not living like Jesus. They are not living like the example that Paul set, and they are preaching a false gospel. And partly the reason that they're preaching a false gospel is because it's what's popular. It's what the audience wants to hear. And so they're coming and they're listening, and their crowd is getting larger. And as their crowd gets larger, their pocket gets more full. And so Paul challenges this problem in Ephesus, and his problem with this is that it's the exact opposite of the gospel. That the story of Jesus is not someone who gains riches from godliness, but someone who surrenders their riches and receives godliness in that. That Jesus' true godliness, according to Paul's letter to the church in Philippi in chapter 2, his true godliness is found in his willingness to surrender all that he has, not in how much money he has or how much wealth he has, but in how much he's willing to give. And so Paul concludes this book, this letter to Timothy, by challenging him and challenging the church in Ephesus to be content. He says words that are familiar to the words of Jesus, that we don't lay up our treasures here on earth, but we lay up our treasures in heaven. And so this week, we want you to challenge your group with the same thing that Paul challenges Timothy and the church in Ephesus. He says, be rich in good works, not in goods. Be rich in what you do, not in what you have. Be content with the things that you have, and the things that you have in abundance, be willing to give. And so we want you to challenge your group with an old spiritual discipline known as simplicity. Now, simplicity can be a little confusing, but simplicity is simply choosing the simplest thing, right? So we want you to challenge them to practice that 2 times this week. 2 times we want you to challenge them to practice simplicity. And it can be as simple as when they go grocery shopping, not buying the name brand of groceries, but buying a knockoff brand to save some money, and then giving that money to someone in need, the money that they save. That's a simple act of simplicity. Maybe a more complicated one is choosing to not spend money and polluting the earth by driving to work this week, but choosing to ride the bus. That's a more complex, more challenging one. But what we see in the spiritual disciplines and in the act of simplicity is that our outward life, our outward actions begin to shape our inward reality. And that because we're choosing to live simply, our heart is content with what we have and willing to give what we have in abundance. So we want to heed the challenge of Paul to be content. We want to live simply this week. That's our main idea. That's our weekly challenge. We hope you have a great week, and we will see you soon.